We've tested. Ladies and gentlemen, if I can pretend that this is a classroom and get you to take your seats like the good students you are. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this wonderful institution in really breathtaking surroundings to, I think, is a absolutely seminal event, a historic event, and that's celebrating perhaps the most important project of the European Union. We're celebrating 30 years of Jean Monnet projects, Jean Monnet outreach, Jean Monnet research and activities, and we have an absolutely stellar panel lined up and an incredibly sort of complicated running order. This is what happens when you ask a professor to mastermind the panel. It's divided into 4 separate themes with 7 people doing 2 sub-themes, so there will be an exam at the end, and do pay attention. I'm going to give over now to Themis Christophidou, who is the Director General of DG Education, Culture, Youth and Sport. She has really the best job in the world, I think. Themis, would you like to open the conference? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amelia. It is indeed the best job in the world, probably after yours, though. I think yours is even better. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a real privilege to be in your company today, top experts in both the European project and in education. After all, you have dedicated your work to the cause of Europe, researching how this fascinating project functions and how it can prosper. It is worth our efforts, is it not? The European Union is a project of peace. The founding idea of our union was to help business weave our communities together across borders instead of having soldiers crossing borders to tear our communities apart. This strategy created the biggest single market in the world. But as President Juncker stated in his latest State of the Union address, Europe is more than a single market. It's more than money, more than the euro. It has always been about values. And indeed, values are our compass. The founding values of the European project have oriented our communities in a common direction, bringing people together well after the groundwork on creating the single market was done. Yet, these values we hold so high: freedom, democracy, the rule of law, respect of human dignity. Are these values not increasingly threatened? Populism and nationalism, xenophobia and the discrimination of minorities, the increase of fake news and misinformation, all of these aim to weaken the European project. I have grown up with the belief that all of us, especially those of us in a privileged position, have an obligation to pass on the best of our generation to the next one. That we have an obligation to make the world a better place for our youth. But what if such a fast-changing world keeps shifting the ground upon our greatest treasure, our most valuable inheritance, peace, rests? In the words of Franklin Roosevelt, we cannot always build the future for our youth, but we can build our youth for the future. This means to me working harder to provide the skills and competences that youth need today. Not only to engage with a more complex and fast-changing world, but to prevent undesirable developments that could threaten our democracy. Just as it means giving our people the reasons to exercise those skills, a clear stake in the democratic process. I am proud to say that we're not starting from scratch here. Young people aged from 18 to 34 stand more favorably towards the EU than people aged 50 and older. The Brexit vote clearly demonstrated this. 73% of Britons under 24 voted Remain, as did 62% of voters between 25 and 34. Our young people rightly take mobility for granted. They see Europe as their home and want to be able to travel, to live, study, and work in any other member state as they would in their own country. And our young people believe the EU can do more. The Eurobarometer survey released just a few days ago shows the following. More than 2/3 of the young people would like Europe to focus on protecting the environment and fight against climate change over the next 10 years. The next priority for youth is improving education and training, followed by fighting poverty, economic and social inequalities. These young people know where they belong. They belong in the European project. The Erasmus Plus program, which you know very well includes the Jean Monnet actions, has been pivotal in the creation of this sense of belonging. Up to now, 10 million young people had the chance to take a big leap and immerse themselves in distant places in our continent, and many more got to know these young people in the host countries. This might not sound as groundbreaking as it is. The youngest of you in this room might think this is an overstatement, an exaggeration. After all, Europe is not that large, is it? Well, I'm old enough to remember a time when European states felt much more distant from each other. And to change this was the actual purpose of Erasmus. In the words of the late Italian scholar Umberto Eco, Erasmus has created the first generation of young Europeans. Young people are not willing to give up these opportunities. And while this is very good news for all of us, we should not risk taking this goodwill for granted. Instead, we must continue to turn Europe into something they can experience, something they can connect with. This requires ambition, taking away barriers to mobility, boosting language and digital learning, and working towards truly European universities. In other words, a European education area where learning mobility is a given, where Europe remains the continent of excellence in education and research. It also requires breaking down silos, recognizing the pivotal role of culture in promoting active citizenship and the common values of the EU. These ambitions are supported by an increased budget proposal for the new financing period 2021-2027. The European Commission proposed doubling the budget for the Erasmus program, which, if it's adopted, hopefully, will open new possibilities for the Jean Monnet program as well. The European Parliament wants to triple the program, so much the better. Let's see what the member states will say. Ladies and gentlemen, young people are, by and large, ready to continue to weave our countries together through the discovery of the other, mutual respect and celebration of our diversity. And yet, that does not mean that these young people who are taught to be critical are not critical on Europe. We need only to look at the current climate activists to see that young people can make their voices heard, and they sometimes disagree very much with our policies. We need to do better in listening carefully. If we want to take advantage of the engagement of the youth and occasionally of the not-so-young people to strengthen our democracy, the European institutions need to improve how we understand the nuances of what European citizens want. Democracy is as much about voting as it is about getting involved and committing to a common cause. We need to stay connected to our communities, particularly our engaged youth, without missing the complex, often fascinating changes they would like to see and embody through participatory action. In this respect, Jean Monnet professors, you are essential. First, your research regularly addresses precisely the issues on which we need to focus the most. You are fundamental in our collective attempt to find workable solutions that accurately and earnestly represent the citizens' goals. By adding depth to our fascinating project, a project the likes of which the world has never seen before, you are helping us to better adapt our institutions in a changing world without compromising the values we all hold dear. Second, Jean Monnet professors have an irreplaceable added value as they connect European policymakers to academia and to the brightest among the youth. After all, a significant part of Jean Monnet actions involves teaching young people about Europe, having them research our institutions and think critically about how we can improve. This link grounds policymakers to excellent insights from engaged and informed citizens. I suppose this is what democracy is about. And if you ask yourselves about a metric of your impact, let me give you the numbers. Since its launch 30 years ago, the Jean Monnet program has reached 9,000 university teachers in 1,000 universities in 100 different countries. Every year, more than 300,000 students are involved in educational activities supported by the program. This is what we can call success. But success is never complete, so we need to do more. Otherwise, there wouldn't be much point in hosting this discussion today. Which brings me to my third point. We all want the Jean Monnet actions to reach an even broader audience in the future, going beyond the university walls. We cannot afford to stay confined to academia. We must not lose those people who have not had the privilege to study at university. In its contribution to the CBU leaders meeting next week, the Commission will call on European leaders to promote teaching and learning about the Union at all levels of education. And the next Erasmus program will be able to do exactly that, also through extended Jean Monnet actions. More than ever before, we should broaden our scope and address pupils, those in vocational education and training, the media, and even local politicians. They also need the excellent knowledge you produce, communicated in the most effective way, to inform, to engage, and to stimulate critical thinking. To that end, we're working hard to extend the Jean Monnet actions to secondary schools. In fact, already in 2016, we started discussing that learning EU at school would be important, highlighting the importance of educating about Europe at an earlier stage. The Council recommendation on promoting common values, inclusive education, and European dimension of training has put teaching and learning about Europe firmly on our policy agenda. In less than a week in CBU, we hope European leaders will carry this commitment forward. We need all hands on deck, especially member state governments, if we're to succeed in sharing the boon of the European project in word and in deed. I strongly believe that the earlier we start to explain our integration to young people, the better. We need to bring Europe, its history, its founding values, its actions and policies, its accomplishments, and also its challenges, closer to everyone. To promote critical awareness in ways that do not indoctrinate, but inspire. Ladies and gentlemen, the EU, you know it better than me, is a project of peace, founded upon our common values, grounded in engaged and informed citizens. In this fast-changing world, if we want to preserve the core of such a precious project, we must provide it with flexibility. This can only be found in excellent knowledge and research, in innovation and constant assessment of our policy work. Throughout these last 30 years, Jean Monnet actions have contributed to this noble goal. You, Jean Monnet professors, have connected policymakers to your research, analyzed and synthesized the nuance of the European project. You and your students are a crucial element of this long-term strategy. You are one of our best hopes to prepare our democracy for a fast-changing future. I thank you very much.
Themis, thank you so much. I love the idea of all hands on deck, and I think having a room replete with the highest quality thinking and all of the European professors in one place is a marvelous opportunity, so I'm very grateful for those opening remarks. I'd like to move now into the next part, and I wanted very much to get the viewpoints and the memories of everybody on the panel in two separate areas. On Erasmus and on Jean Monnet, many students I know have been Erasmus students, many professors have been Erasmus students as well, and all of you have some connection with Jean Monnet. So to set the tone and sort of set the context, I'd like to invite the first four panelists, and we'll go in the order that you can see on the screen, with Renaud and Martina, and then Alberto and Joao. First of all, introducing themselves to you, and then very briefly providing you with their memories of Erasmus and or Jean Monnet. So Renaud, I'm delighted to hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Renaud Dehousse, president of the EUI, as you can see on the screen, but also Jean Monnet professor. I want to emphasize in my previous capacities. And let me simply say, before I address your points, that it's a great honor and pleasure for the Institute to host this event. It's important for us to relate to our peers in all the European countries, and this is a formidable way to, take stock of what's been done and also think of future challenges that we will have to address. But turning to your, let's say, invitation to address what all this may have meant for me personally, so to say, I have to start by a confession, which is that I'm old enough to have known the world before the Jean Monnet program. And it's yes, I know it's tragic. And precisely it's important in this moment of celebration to remember where we come from. When I did study, it, for us, was a natural thing to, when we were privileged to go to the university, to go to the closest university, because basically there was no real emphasis on mobility. And the idea of going abroad was something that was reserved to a tiny elite of people who were specialized. The vast majority simply went closest to their home. And they could, of course, follow extremely developed programs, but programs in which it was a rare event to ever come across somebody who was from another university. And if you think of it in larger terms, it also meant that it resulted, of course, in a fair degree of conservatism. It was not officially stated, but there were national ways of doing things, and by definition, they were to be preferred to those of other countries. I mean, in some disciplines, there is a reference, for instance, to the interesting concept of methodological nationalism, which really illustrates what I mean. Namely, if you don't belong to the right church or school of thought, your possibilities of making an academic career are limited. That's what it meant. Now, this also explains my interest as a student for this beautiful place, where I was a student many years ago, because it was then one of the only transnational institutions where indeed you could be exposed to a variety of national cultures and ways of doing things, which is the best way, I think, to acquire critical distance from one's own approaches, often presented as if they were natural or the only ones. Needless to say, and I jump to the present situation, a lot has happened. The landscape has dramatically changed. If you have the privilege of having kids, you know that their horizon is not even confined to the borders of Europe. It's a global horizon. It's also clear that mobility is not the only change that has taken place. Because there was mobility, it was bound to have an impact on curriculum and ultimately on the career of scholars in a number of fields in which indeed there started to be movement. Now we know that officially the EU is not to be taken as responsible for that. This is something completely different. But let me ask you, would there have been a Bologna process if there had been no mobility? And would we have reached the kind of gradual convergence movement, with due respect, of course, for national identities, if mobility had not existed? I don't think so. What I want to say, and I'll close this intervention with this remark, is that European programs are a formidable lever to achieve change. I mean, and here I refer to my experience in a well-known French institution of higher education, Sciences Po, where I was basically brought to 20 years ago to open up the place to Europe. And it's clear that the possibility of having access to a range of instruments and programs, limited as those may be, because contrary to what one thinks, it's not that you're overwhelmed by an avalanche of money, but simply this is critical money in the sense, critical assistance, in the sense that it provides you with a range of opportunities that you would not have had otherwise. And it did provide me, in my experience as a Jean Monnet professor, with plenty of opportunities to establish contacts with a wide range of colleagues within my institution, with other institutions, which even at the national level is important. In other words, it's a real catalyst for change that we have with those programs, and that's, I think, a lesson that we need to think about. Europe is often assimilated with, a kind of Leviathan, which wants to completely do away with national differences. That is not at all the point, and the Jean Monnet program illustrates this very well. It's just providing seed money, which is then of great importance for those of us who want to get things to change, which we all want to achieve, I think.
Bruno, that's lovely. I've always thought of Jean Monnet as a critical catalyst. Martina, I wonder if we can continue on with you with your views and your remembrances of these.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy that I can address you at this particular moment. I'm a Minister of Education, Research, Science and Sports of the Slovak Republic. And first I plan to say something like very institutional, but then Amelia really encouraged me to be very personal, because this is about our memories of the process. That's why I would actually start by following up on Mr. President, who said that he was lucky enough to know the world before the start of this institution. I wasn't that lucky, luckily, but my integration prospect started in 1990s, where we had the Velvet Revolution and all the fall of Iron Curtain, as you would remember, and this was, I would say, a major boost to European integration also. And what happened to us at that point was that, actually I was then in my 20s, and I was just finishing the university, the graduate student, the master, and it, all of a sudden it came all this fresh air, and it brought in a lot of international perspectives into our study. It brought in a lot of perspective for interdisciplinarity. This is exactly what also the President was mentioning, opening up and melanging various approaches and methodologies. And it even, and this is particularly important in the perspective of EUI, is that it actually changed the paths of many people towards social sciences and humanities. Because previously, social sciences and humanities were, in our part of the world, were very ideologized, and maybe people wouldn't want to study it because of this ideological framework. And this is actually what happened to me also, because I graduated originally from mathematics and physics in '91, and then all of a sudden happened to be a PhD student in an American economics program because I had mathematics background, so they accepted me. And all of a sudden, and now what I did for living, because before becoming this minister, I was actually in social sciences. So this is really something, and thanks to processes like European integration, like opening up, my life career has taken this very, I would say, volatile but also very interesting path. So this is something really that many people, and me personally, and also many other people in Slovakia very much appreciate it. And that's why I'm also very happy that I can be here as one of the still non-member countries representative, but hopefully soon to be a member country, because we really need to attach a lot of importance to SSH, because nowadays with the technical sciences we see there is a lot of, let's say, supremacy of the technical sciences, and we in our international cooperation support a lot of technical sciences, but we really, I think the success of European integration is in the social sciences and humanities, and we really need to grab the approach from this side. So I would very much like to pledge that we will do all possible efforts to join the EUI as a Slovak Republic, as one of the last, I would say, 5 or 6 countries of the EU that has still not joined. And this is my really personal wish, and I'll do all my best to achieve this goal by the end of our term. But then also, let me tell you why it is so very important for us still to be a part of this group, because we, after 15 years of joining the EU, we still perceive ourselves as a new member state. And we still grasp with and struggle with the lack of scientific excellence. So if you look at our performance in Horizon 2020 and other excellence-based competitions, we are still falling out of the picture, because actually historically the level of scientific excellence in our countries is not so good to be on a leveling playing fields with all this competition. And that's why we particularly appreciate Erasmus and Jean Monnet programs, because they are based on participation. They're really based on true participation, and they are allowing everyone in Europe to take part. So they are very inclusive mechanisms, and this is something that we need from our perspective to be really amalgamated into the European education and research space. In Slovakia, we have 5.5 million inhabitants. We have around 40 universities. You can imagine how weak and atomized they are, and really their level of excellence is not good enough to compete for Horizon 2020 without being integrated into these larger pools and without even being integrated among themselves. So the idea of integration is very crucial for us to actually survive and to be able to attract the grants and not to fall behind even more. So being based on participation is very appealing feature of this program. And I think in Slovakia, but also in Europe, Erasmus is perceived as a flagship thing, as the success program of the EU, which helped millions of people to mobility. For us, it's even more important because it prevents also, in a sense, a brain drain. Because our countries, we are very much exposed to our students living abroad, going to the West, where they perceive everything is better than here. And Erasmus is one of the schemes that helps the young people to go abroad, to get the experience, to get the exposure, and then to come back and continue their studies or to work in our countries. So even in that sense, Erasmus is a very useful scheme, and very much encourage our students to take it up during their studies. Slovak universities have been actively participating in Jean Monnet programs in various chairs, in various modules. So I'm also very happy to see that, and of course we would like to even further this beyond. So the integration, the participation, and the very last thing, which I find very appealing, is that it's not only the participative approach, it's also the thematic focus on integration per se, which makes this program very special. Because if we need to further integrate in Europe, which we obviously need, and also Themis, as she said in her speech, that the EU states felt distance from each other. This is something we really need to overcome in the future. Then this kind of instrument, which is based on participation rather than fierce competition, and which is actually thematically focused on integration, is the way forward. So that's why I would like to say that both from my personal perspective and also from the perspective of Slovakia as a country, we very much appreciate this scheme, and we really truly vote for it being forwarded and extended even further. Thank you so much for your attention.
Tina, thank you so much. It's really compelling and a passionate overview. I love the path-changing nature of that. I think that's really important. Alberto, can we come to you? Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alberto Alemanno. I'm a professor of European law in Paris, and I'm quite an engaged academic and educator in the European space. Well, it might appear or it might sound a rhetorical device, but I'm going to say this anyway. I wouldn't be here today without the Erasmus program. Erasmus changed my life deeply. It has been a game changer. European education has been a game changer for someone who was born and grew up in the suburb of a very industrial city like Torino in the north of Italy. And I had my first experience outside of the comfort zone that was given to me by the local university, because I still come from those years in which we were not really mobile. You were studying where you were born, and it was already a privilege. But that city, Torino, was a city where there was very little social mobility, and now probably there's even less. So in a way, Erasmus detached me from my roots, but at the same time gave me meaning outside of this space. I will spare you my Erasmus memories because they might be a bit wild. Lucky enough, social media were not there. They were totally inexistent. So I feel quite safe to move on and to fast forward and to say that not only I did Erasmus, but I also became a Jean Monnet professor. So I've been collecting experiences, all what I could get. I actually try to hold this. If there's anything like a European dream, I think I had my little European dream, meaning that Europe changed my life. All these educational experiences, which of course are a combination of national educational experiences where I grew up. On top, I had my European layer. Today, the lucky few, those who like me did Erasmus, are 9 million in Europe since 1987. So we are a considerable number, perhaps not enough, because many more might have privilege of that experience. And obviously, it's very reassuring to see that the European Union is moving towards a very ambitious goal of tripling down not only the number of university students who can move around, but also those who are involved in other kind of trainings, and therefore mainstreaming the way in which this experience might happen. A few considerations that go back to my experience. Today, those who did Erasmus, these 9 millions, are very likely to belong to another category of European citizens. And these are those who live in another country of the European Union. And we are around 17 million, and many of those actually did the Erasmus program. However, as you might know very well, especially those who read the piece I wrote yesterday in The Guardian, this community of 17 million Europeans are not necessarily perceived as they should. Why? Because in today's time, we are often perceived as an elite. We are often perceived as not socially diverse. And socioeconomic data suggest another story, suggest a more nuanced story. Those who are mobile in Europe today are not necessarily those 9 million who did Erasmus. You also have those. But you also have many other blue-collar workers who are part of this mobile, liquid, I would say, community of people who are socially diverse and I would say politically largely disenfranchised. Data suggests that these 17 million people, the typical French living in Germany or the German living in Italy, well, only 8% of them do register to vote for the European elections. Their major opportunity to get political representation in Europe, and only half of them actually turn out to vote. So there's a very significant phenomenon which is overlooked and in which I feel caught myself in because I happen to live in Spain, to teach in France and being Italian. So even for somebody like me who follow those issues, it's not easy to be registered where I should be registered and to vote in 1 month's time. So the message I would like to convey in a provocative manner, because this is my job today, is to say, what a paradox. The people are most European, the people are more exposed to this European experience of life, are those who are the least politically represented. There are those who are feeling today not necessarily comfortable because they are perceived as part of an elite, even though they're not, which is my story. And at the same time, they struggle in engaging with this European public sphere, which is no longer a given, but is something which is incredibly questioned. So there's a feeling of discomfort, which still make me feel quite optimistic, but is not making my life easy in the sense that Europe is no longer à la mode, Europe is no longer mainstream, Europe is something that has to be explained and justified when you explain that you work for the European institutions or that you believe or you belong to a community that has been growing up out of the European project. And these are deep questions that keep me busy and awake at night sometimes, and on which I feel very engaged, and I would be happy to continue sharing with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I like the circle that Alberto has suggested, that to some extent Erasmus detached you from your roots, and that in a way maybe Jean Monnet reattaches you to Europe. I think there's a sort of circular logic there that we can play out. Joao, can we move to you?
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm the youngest in the panel, I can assume. I'm turning 31 in 2 weeks, meaning that I was born exactly 1 year after the Erasmus Plus program was created, and 1 year before Jean Monnet was created. So I was born in this period where the idea of the European Union was becoming a lot more complex and a lot more meaningful for the actual citizens than it was in the 80s. I come from the suburbs of Lisbon, sharing the personal story, and I'm actually the first person in my inner family, my closer family, to have completed high school, not even just university, high school. In the meantime, I did Erasmus twice, in my bachelor's and in my master's. I did 2 youth exchanges, and I have attended classes funded by the Erasmus Mundus program, but also by Jean Monnet. The EU, for me, and Erasmus, and all of the educational opportunities provided by the EU are just a natural part of my path. It's not something I question, not something I ever questioned. It's something I always have taken for granted. But in the network that I today have the pleasure to coordinate, and I work with about 13,000 volunteers in 39 countries, and in the many Key Action 2, Key Action 3 projects that I have the pleasure to coordinate as well, the reality is that we understand, because we are very, very close to the students and very, very close to local communities, that these opportunities are still not for everybody. And this is how we dedicate most of our time. As we speak, I have people from my team in Singapore in a capacity building event trying to raise the profile of local students in the region. I have people in Paris organizing the biggest sports competition for Erasmus students. And I'm right here in front of a very, very distinct audience. The work of this organization and the work of Erasmus is still uncompleted. But I believe that through panels like this, but also through actions in the terrain like the one in Singapore and like the one in Paris, we will eventually make the difference we have to make.
Joao, thank you very much indeed. One thing that's key, I think, is the ability of Jean Monnet to produce the highest quality research and teaching. I think some of the most memorable lectures that I've received and hopefully given as well rest on a strong edifice of enlightened and creative thinking, and that just simply wouldn't be the case without Jean Monnet. What I'd like to ask the panelists now to reflect on, really, is where we're going now in terms of higher education. In what way does education connect with some of the key internal challenges within the European Union? I've given them a wide spectrum of things to choose from, including, as you can say, citizenship, but also changing pedagogy, the way in which we engage with students, the way in which we understand a classroom, the idea of flipped learning inside and outside of the classroom walls, for example, connecting with the youth, and also the range of disciplines. I think Martina put her finger on it. It's a combination of political science and social science and even the hard sciences as well. So I'd like to move back to Martina, if I can, and just get your opinion on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Actually, this topic is so broad that within this allocation of 3 to 4 minutes, I cannot really cover it. So that's why I decided to focus more on one of these or two of these topics, which is a digital agenda and interdisciplinarity, because this is something that we have been struggling with since quite some time in Slovakia. Because, you know OECD, we are a member country of the OECD. They came up with a study that shows how many workplaces are endangered by automation and digitalization. And Slovakia is a top champion in the sense that 60% of jobs are endangered and 30% of jobs are really at a very high risk. And this is also due to perhaps industrial structure, that we have a very high concentration of automotive industry, And 60% of our jobs are likely to disappear within the next decade due to high automation and digitalization processes. So this is a very, very serious thing that we should try to solve now. And that's why we are focusing in higher education on digitalization and also interdisciplinarity at the same time. This is because we basically, what we have in Slovakia, we have decreasing take-up of IT studies and decreasing take-up of mathematics and physics, because people perceive it as a very difficult study. Nobody wants to study mathematics anymore. Everybody's afraid of it. So our IT schools are having lower intake of students. At the same time, these are the guys who are most needed to overcome the machines. And we have actually declining student cohort applying for these studies. That's why we are trying to make it a bit more, let's say, attractive, a bit more interdisciplinary, to bring in more people into the game. Now, what we face here, that we have actually programs that are focused on bringing up high-level programists, like IT guys working for ESSED and coding the programs, which is a top notch of the discipline. And then we have some programs which are really addressing the very basic skills, like basic literacy, how to turn on computer and how to push the buttons. And we have nothing in between. And there is something already flying in the air, which is called digital steward. This is a profession that will be needed in hundreds of thousands in Europe, and basically none of the programs or EQF are focusing on these professions. This is something, these are people who have very decent level of digital skills and programming, but at the same time they are doing other professions. Because we don't need only programmers, we need people who are doing any other job, and at the same time they are very proficient with the IT and the digital world. And this is something that we are lacking in our programs and curricula. And as I was sniffing around, we couldn't find any inspiration also in the other European programs. So this is a big challenge that we actually need to address. And perhaps also the Jean Monnet programs and the interdisciplinarity and integrative aspects of this program have a good standing platform to address these issues. So interdisciplinarity and digital education, new methods in teaching them, and bringing the IT industry into any other, I would say mainstreaming IT into any other type of job is among the top agendas that we are now struggling with in Slovakia. Thank you.
Okay, Martina, thank you very much. I'm tempted to ask Themis if she's taking notes or if this is becoming something of a shopping list, because I think this is item one, a sort of digi Jean Monnet, which is clearly going to be a need. Alberto, could you favor us with your perspectives?
Yeah, happy to. Now that you know my story, you won't be surprised to hear that when I joined academia, I finally made it. It took many years of studying and writing articles and teaching. It was in 2009, so 10 years ago, I had my aha moment. And the aha moment was basically suggesting that I was experiencing a very significant gap between my academic experience and the realities of society. I could really see that what I was supposed to do was not necessarily addressing needs which were present in society. I knew that indirectly my work in the library and my research papers were somehow affecting, perhaps in the future, that society. But I felt that the detachment, or at least the space existing between my daily contribution and the impact, were just too far away from my expectations and from my taste. So for a few years, I didn't say anything because I need to get full professorship, I need to get tenure, and I was writing my pieces and ticking the box. Since I got my tenure, I'm a bit freer to experiment and pioneer. Why is it important to pioneer new ways of doing research and new ways of doing teaching and being in the classroom? Well, I think because we spend too much time in the classroom and we don't spend enough time in the streets. And I'm not suggesting that academics have to be turned into advocates or into preachers or in social workers, but I think we need to question why for centuries universities played a significant role in their territory. If you think of Bologna or Paris or any university established in the 15th, 16th centuries, there were universities whose contribution was embedded into those communities. It was so evident that the university were briefing out of what the community was able to produce and vice versa. There was a virtuous circle. Education was the glue of society. Today, education, think about my previous story, is one of the major forces that is dividing society. You're an expert. You're a professor. You're an academic. We read this every single day. And this makes people like us uncomfortable, but make people comfortable to say that we are part of the problem. So if we are part of the problem, it's probably because we never thought about becoming again part of the solution. But for many centuries, universities have been part of a solution. So how can we go there? I think if you look in a very sharp and detached way at the incentive mechanism that govern higher education today, all what we're supposed to do is to do research, which is perfectly fine, it's part of our job. But there's no incentive whatsoever to do anything else. Even education is not as, I would say, considered or valued as much as it should be. So how can we go beyond that? I think there are two things which could be said. Let's think about the state of scholarship today. In average, a scientific article is read by 10 people. If they're the right people, it could make a huge difference, but it's still not enough. And that's why we need to make a huge effort to translate our research insight into plain language and to make sure that those ideas travel, reach, talk to policymakers so that they could be implemented faster in order to close that gap I was referring to. And when it comes to teaching, I think we are still teaching in a way Plato's or the pre-Socrates were actually doing. We walk into a classroom, we talk to people, we get a few questions and reactions, and we assess and value. The system hasn't changed so much. And obviously, this should be questioned today, a society in which knowledge is shared, is accessible, and we have to think about many of the ideas that Martina suggested and how to make them a bit more mainstream, a bit more accepted. Here, the data for me is the retention rate of lecturing. If I lecture, you will remember 5% of what I be saying. But if you practice, if you do things in class, your retention rate will go up to 50, 60%. All these data are established, all these data are universal, they apply anywhere, but we are not doing enough in order to turn this into new teaching methods which are imposed. My brief experience over the last 5, 6 years has been to see how knowledge can be shared much better when it is actionable. When my students 2 weeks ago had the chance to say, we have a problem in Europe because Facebook is preventing all European political parties, all civil society organizations, and the European institutions themselves to run ads, meaning sponsor contents, in order to have people get to vote in 1 month, they got very excited. And they are the ones who helped me drafting letters, doing social media work to spread the news, and we got a lot of media attention. We are putting pressure on Facebook, on the leadership, and also on the Commission itself to go after Facebook, because we realize that today social media are an essential facility without which any government or any policymaker can get elected or can reach out to people. These are the kind of stories which are out there, and our students, our research can actually mobilize those stories and be an active part of this. We can do it.
Thank you very much, Alberto. That was wonderful. So Themis, next on your shopping list, I think, is Jean Monnet No Walls, the idea of transcending and reconnecting, which would be great. Joao, over to you.
Yes. So when it comes to the challenge of evolving society and the role of Erasmus and all of that, I think it's important to say a few things. First things first. A flash Eurobarometer was just released 3 days ago about youth participation and engagement. And some numbers are quite interesting. 31% of young people aged 15 to 30 have stayed abroad for at least 2 weeks. 31%. And out of those that did not go abroad, at least half wanted or would have liked to go abroad for at least this amount of time. 72% have voted in local or national or European elections, which is a big contrast when you realize that in 2014, only 27 to 28% of young people voted in European elections. And also 3 out of 4 actively engaged in some form of organized movement or volunteering, from, of course, the climate strike to just everyday volunteering in your community. So the first thing that has to be clear when we talk about young people and participation in society is that in reality we are dealing with a generation that is already quite engaged, contrary to what might be the perception of many. Now, what Erasmus and Jean Monnet do to these people is that they activate the European side within them. They already are engaged, they are already interested in the progress of society. They might not be so much at European level because it might feel distant. Programs like this bring Europe closer to the citizens. Some studies have shown, the Erasmus Impact Study, of course, says that 93% of alumni of Erasmus imagine living abroad, against 73% of non-mobile. And we, the Erasmus Student Network, we ran a study a few years ago showing that Erasmus alumni were 3 times more likely to vote in European elections than non-mobile students. 3 times more likely. Now, what organizations like mine do is to bring more value to every euro that is invested in mobile students, because we connect these mobile students with the local communities. Just in fall last year, we organized more than 500 activities connecting Erasmus students with the local communities. We reached 26,000 people, so every euro that was invested in that one Erasmus student multiplied itself a lot into the people that then were affected by the presence of these Erasmus students. My point is that there is a limit in what Erasmus Plus and Jean Monnet can do by themselves alone. They cannot survive without the support of civil society organizations like mine, but of every single individual that is interested in that. And the reasons are many. Of course, in the first place, education is a national competence. Let's not forget about that. That's the very first thing. Member states can opt or not to integrate these programs. Then, of course, the European Union has a much deeper PR challenge that cannot be solved just through the Erasmus Plus program or through Jean Monnet. It's a PR challenge that, in countries like the DG's country, like Mrs. Temi's country, the perception of values that moved the European Union, the value that is the base of the European Union, they were not there when the migration challenge was a thing. They were not there when the financial crisis was knocking on the door and Greece was kindly asked by many to leave the Eurozone. So, of course, many people today question, is there any solidarity at all? People remember, people don't forget those things. Finally, citizenship can only take place if all of us as a society are engaged from a very young age. In order to happen, participation needs 3 main things. It needs tools, so it needs space. Young people from a very young age need to be instigated to participate in student unions, to be the representative of their class from the age of 10, like I was. It needs information and reliable information and media literacy, digesting that information. And it ultimately needs education. Education about the EU, of course, but education of what it means to be a citizen in the 21st century. Now, just to conclude and to wrap it up, of course, these programs can do a lot, but they cannot do anything if left alone. The member states have a responsibility, and all of us as citizens have a responsibility. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think you got a wonderful, clear image there of Jean Monnet as a multiplier. It is a multiplier, but in order to remain a multiplier, it needs support, and that means collaboration from the member states and budget, to put too fine a point on it. I'd like to return now to the Jean Monnet program and Erasmus Memories and invite Andre to participate in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. It's a huge pleasure to be here. My name is Andre Zwitter. I'm a professor of governance and innovation and the dean of a 1-year-old faculty in a university that is 405 years old. So we face our own personal challenges, and I would love to tell you about, I did the maths, 1,700 master students of Erasmus, Masters of Excellence that went through my hands and how I've impacted on their lives. But the truth is the impact on me has been probably much greater than on my students. And I could also tell you about probably what these students mean for EU citizenship and for global citizenship. But again, I think what these students have meant on how we designed our new program has been much greater. We heard that 9 million Erasmus students have already passed the program, and I think that is a tremendous achievement. And within this amount of students, only a handful have ever crossed my path. But I do actually notice that whenever I'm somewhere in the world and teaching in a different university, last time in Kyoto, I actually heard somebody say, Andre. And I turned around, it was a former student of mine. So to see that it is not restricted to Europe, but it is really a global endeavor, is really something impactful. So what has Erasmus taught me then? First and foremost, I noticed that one big challenge that I had to overcome is intercultural communication. How I expected as an Austrian academic to be addressed, how I expected that academic communication among students would happen, was fundamentally challenged by experiencing students from all across Europe. And I believe that all of my colleagues have had similar experiences. It allowed me to understand that communication really is one of the fundamental aspects, both for higher education in Europe, but also for European citizenship as a whole. And communication on the basis of understanding each other. Furthermore, exchange of ideas and exchange of staff have been probably the second most important lessons that I've learned. We are nowadays living in a time where, possibly understandably so due to market pressures and so forth, countries tend to look inwards again and want to develop programs that are specifically dedicated to foster their own national interests. But when we look 400 years back, then we see that the reason why European universities have been so successful is because they've always been international. The second oldest university in the Netherlands, the University of Franeker, that nobody of you will probably know, because Napoleon closed it 200 years ago, could boast that it had scholars from Hungary, scholars from Germany, and even 1 year René Descartes studied in the little city of Franeker. So the quality of education has been, and the quality of research has always been very much due to the diversity that we offered, and the diversity to which Erasmus was always pledged. So what it then meant for us when 2 years ago I was asked to develop this new faculty, it meant that we had to be interdisciplinary. It meant that we had to address global challenges, those that connect us all, climate change, migration, and so forth. But it also meant that we needed to strive for a population amongst our students that would provide a window to Europe and a window to the world. So when students come to us, they can be assured that there will be 50% non-Dutch students. And that is really remarkable for students to experience that. But also we have, amongst our academic staff members, 80% international staff that we also specifically recruited in order to provide this diversity. And what we also heard already in our panel, we are facing challenges that are challenges of understanding, challenges both in terms of cultural, but also in terms of technological domains. So we have decided that data science needs to be at the fundament of our education. It is one of the new methods and methodologies that we need to be able to comprehend, that we need to be able also to transmit to a larger society. So when I speak of a European or a global challenge, then I think the most important challenge is to raise awareness of the existence of these global challenges, but also that only through this diversity that I was allowed to experience, we can tackle these. So that was the lessons I've learned through Erasmus.
Andre, thank you very much indeed. Lorenzo, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilia. Good morning, everyone. Well, I could have said exactly what has already been said. I think there's a profound agreement around the table about the Jean Monnet experience for me. I mean, I've been a Jean Monnet professor now for almost 10 years, and it's in a sense it's ingrained in the life history of Mr. Monnet himself. I don't know how many of you have ever read his biographies, and Jean Monnet was a very eclectic human being, he had a passion for life. He married a woman who was divorced in Italy. She couldn't get married in Italy, so they married in Russia, so they could be allowed to get married. He was an integrated European long before Europe got integrated. And in a sense, his personal lifestyle united different skills. It was a lawyer, but he was a diplomat, and at the same time worked within the French ministerial machinery. And very well that, when the text of the Schuman Declaration was written, Jean Monnet changed some parts of that so that it was much more in favor of quick integration than it should have been, right? So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I think programs like the Jean Monnet program, the Jean Monnet chairs, the bursaries, the Erasmus, are probably one of the best things that European Union has ever done. Hitting below the surface of public perception, because besides those in this room, very few people probably know about the Jean Monnet program, and more students get to know about the Erasmus program. But I think the impact that these things have had on building a common culture, a common understanding of what it means to be European, and also overcoming some of those challenges. One thing I've learned by having traveled across Europe, having worked in 5 different European countries, having married a woman from Germany, having kids that hold 4 different passports, is that we all face the same fears. We all face the same problems. I remember when I was younger, I thought that, only Italians couldn't speak English properly, and then I realized that a lot of other people in many other countries couldn't speak English properly, and I learned that even people from Britain do not speak English that properly. So these are, this is helpful because it helps us overcome that the bias that has for centuries divided the continent. And of course, this has to be cultivated, has to be encouraged. Europe doesn't go on its own. Europe needs to be, it's a ground that needs to be fertilized and continuously watered. And I agree, with what has been said, we do need a different approach to education. It is not possible that we still have the same kind of education model we had roughly hundreds of years ago, if not thousands of years ago. We do need to make research more relevant, teaching and research more relevant. I don't know whether I'm going to get a chance to speak again, but in case I do not, I just want to say this: interdisciplinarity is fundamental. And I think Europe needs to do much better at this. Historically, the American model has been much faster at creating interdisciplinary schools. Universities around the United States of America have had schools, interdisciplinary schools, for years. Schools of government, in which you have a wide range of disciplines, schools of public policy, schools of medicine, schools of life sciences, and so on and so forth. And I think understanding that, as a friend of mine once told me, I don't know whether it was Winston Churchill who said this, but they say that he said so many things, so I'm not sure that, we can credit him with all different kinds of wisdom. But he probably said once, or has been told as saying once, that the world has got problems, but universities have got departments. And that is not okay. We cannot fault people for saying, as Alberto said rightly, that you are an expert, so I do not trust you. Often experts in this sort of education and research model are not the best people equipped to understand phenomena that are fundamentally integrated. So because we're talking about the integration of a continent, I think we should be the most integrated academic system in the world, which doesn't simply mean you can get a certificate in France, which is valid also in Italy. It means integrating knowledge. And that is way more complicated. And now we have all the incentives to do exactly the opposite. We are disintegrating knowledge. And I just finished reading a book, which I think is really, really interesting. It's called Range. I think it's running for the Best Business Book of the Year award. And it's basically, the subtitle is Why Generalists Are Succeeding in a World of Specialization. And I think understanding the universality of knowledge and making Europe able to push for that as aggressively as possible. Thank you.
I think the ultimate generalist was Jean Monnet himself. He was an absolute consummate polymath. And something I think that Jean Monnet does well is it is a polymath output. It is a polymath program. Paola, I was going to pick up on Lorenzo's discussion about people who know English, but it would be a poor introduction to somebody who has to talk about the connection to the United States, so I won't do that.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to share that my own personal experience has been of having spent part of my childhood outside of my home country. So the issue of identity and not sharing the same culture and language have been part of me ever since I was in my early years. And I think that has sort of prepared me into my future professional life that has always been about relationships. Here I bring to the table a discussion on transatlantic and external relations of the EU. The Fulbright program, which is the flagship program scholarship program of the US State Department, has a peculiarity, and that is of partnering with the local government everywhere it operates and becomes a bilateral program. So although stamped and created in the United States, it becomes an equal partner everywhere where it works. And since here we were asked to share some of our recollections and sort of relationship with the Erasmus program, certainly the two programs share the same values of promoting peace by bringing people together. And the Fulbright program was created in 1946, started operating in Europe as the very few first countries where it operated in 1948. So just last year we celebrated our 70th anniversary. So I don't think anyone in the room has actually been long enough to have lived before the Fulbright program. But I want to share a very nice story, and I think the impact of the Fulbright program in the United States, but also in Europe, is best illustrated by its alumni. And I want to mention a couple. One is Professor Sofia Corradi. She is a retired professor of education from the University of Roma Tre. And in the early 60s, she was awarded a Fulbright scholarship at Columbia University in New York. And as part of our regular Fulbright goals, she came back to Italy at the end of her award. But the reason why I mention her is because she's best known as Mamma Erasmus. She is the person who created the Erasmus program. She was awarded the Carlos V Prize for creating the Erasmus program, and the award ceremony was held by King Felipe of Spain and the then President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz. So, and whenever she is interviewed all over Europe and asked, how did you get inspired to create the Erasmus program? Her answer is always, because I had a Fulbright grant. And I learned the value of exchanges. I learned the value of studying somewhere else and coming back home. And obviously, it took many years after her Fulbright grant to get there. But I thought, you know, this is a very good way of connecting the two programs. And I'll also mention that at this very conference, just in a few rooms away, is currently speaking Professor Pasquale Tridico, who is the current president of INPS, so Italy's retirement fund. And he is actually a Fulbright alumnus himself who has studied specifically US-EU relations as part of his Fulbright grant in the United States. So this is my end. Briefly, and then I'll go back to it, I want to mention that The Fulbright program mainly deals with binational programs, but one of its main goals globally is precisely promoting EU integration and the EU project. And so one of its programs is called Fulbright Schumann, focuses specifically on EU-US relations. Thank you.
Paula, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go into the final sort of sub-theme here. I hope you've been keeping notes. And that is a broader overview, I think, of where the European Union is going, not just in the future, but also geopolitically as well, in terms of global challenges. So here I'm going to invite Andre to give us his perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. If we talk of global challenges, then two things come very quickly to mind. Climate change, of course, and maybe the global migration crisis. Now, both in their own way threaten not only our future, but specifically also peace within Europe, as it is pushing to the extreme the willingness of states for cooperation and for burden sharing, but also because the different effects that, for example, climate change have, will force us to collaborate and to cooperate on an unprecedented level if we ever want to at least curb the effects of climate change that are about to happen. If we look at the EU as a peace project, as we have heard our Director General already say, then we are first reminded of Immanuel Kant's work, Perpetual Peace. And in this work of the late 18th century, Immanuel Kant emulates a peace treaty. And one of the fundamentals of this peace treaty he describes as a federation of states that are connected by trade. And this is really where the core of the European Union lied. A federation of states connected by the exchange of services and goods. Now, in the interwar period, we have another group of people that believed that education will be the solution to peace and prosperity and avoiding future wars, the new internationalists. Now, they were proven wrong by the Second World War, but nevertheless, they have left an important mark, namely that education can provide an awareness of what is important and why it is important to collaborate. Now, what has Erasmus brought to us? It has brought together these two ideas, the exchange of goods and services and the exchange of education and ideas. And I think this is really where this importance is to be found of Erasmus and of the exchange within Europe on an academic level. With Erasmus, we have created a connective tissue between European citizenship, between European citizens. 9 million people have been traversing boundaries, have been crossing the borders, and not only have they studied abroad, but they have also, by and large, met partners abroad, have built families abroad, and I would be really curious about the statistics of how many international families we have nowadays because of the Erasmus programs. Mm-hmm. And this is really something where we feel that the fundamentals of peace can be found. If we then look back at these global challenges that we are facing, climate change, migration, and so forth, we start realizing that these are what in game theory could be called a cooperation game problem. If we don't all cooperate, we'll be doomed to fail. And I think this is where we find that the importance of programs such as Erasmus can really be found.
Andre, thank you so much. These are wicked problems, I think, as we teach them, so they very much need clever solutions. Paula, let's turn to you.
Yes, no, I'll just say a few more words about the Fulbright Schumann program. It was created in 1991, and in the context of the broader Fulbright program, and has seen over 300 scholars over these almost 25 years. It is co-financed. What I want to stress here very importantly is that it's co-financed by the United States, but also by the European Union. So it is, in fact, a fully EU program. Its criteria of eligibility are the program is open either to EU citizens who must have lived at least in another European country prior to applying, and will do research in the United States on EU-US relations, or to US citizens who want to come to Europe and study EU-US relations. In their case, they must spend their grant at least in 2 European Union countries. And I also want to congratulate the European University Institute, that is a huge producer of Fulbright Schumann grantees from Europe, as well as a preferred host destination for US scholars. So it operates as a bilateral program, but it's the EU as a whole and the United States. And in the past 3 years, the EU and the US have also started an enrichment seminar program. And here I want to go back to what João was saying about the importance of the network of alumni and the Erasmus Plus alumni, because the participants in these enrichment seminars are Erasmus alumni on the EU side and Fulbright US grantees on the US side. And the meetings have always taken place in Brussels because it is the Belgium Commission with its the Belgium Commission, the Fulbright Belgium Commission, because otherwise it might be mistaken with the EU, that manages the Fulbright Schumann program. And I also, on closing, will mention that, as I was saying, the local government is always a partner. And in our case, in Italy's case, it is Italy's foreign ministry, which is also a huge supporter of this institute. So by offering several scholarships. So it is a great joint effort where we all share the same values and we all want to bring people together and recognize the value of exchanges. Thank you.
Bruno, before we move on to the questions and answer, which will follow, I wonder if you could favor us with your perspectives.
Well, celebrations are also good opportunities, of course, not only to look back, but to think of the future and what should be our objectives for the next 30 years, so to say. And, well, I'm sure that people in the room will have many suggestions in that respect, but let me put one on the table, because I think there is a structural problem which we need to address. The Jean Monnet program, the Erasmus program, like all European programs in higher education and research, are excellence-based. Rightly so. It couldn't be otherwise, because indeed that's the only way we can hope to have a positive impact. But there's always a but. And in this case, it takes the form of a distributive problem. We know that not all countries are equally competitive. We know that some fare better than others. All indicators in terms of not only award of those grants, but also in terms of impact. If you look at the internationalization of higher education systems, at the internationalization of scholars in our countries, at their bibliometric impact, it's very clear that the distribution of benefits is not even. Now, this is a problem we cannot ignore. I'm not suggesting one should away with excellence. I don't want to be misunderstood in that respect. But I say there is a distributive problem. We need to make it our own and ensure that somehow we come up with responses to that kind of problem. Now, what can we do? Well, my recommendations in that respect would be fairly straightforward. First, focus on early stage researchers because they're the key to the future. Yeah, by providing them with instruments that enable them to achieve a bigger impact in their respective discipline and a bit bigger outreach across Europe or indeed on the global plane, we have the keys to the future. So what is needed is a kind of technology transfer, which can be done with, I would say, a series of fairly simple instruments. We must provide these key agents of change with, first, opportunities to confront themselves with top scholars in their field. We must also provide them with the, let's say, the kind of, allow me to say, vocational training that is important for the career of any scholars. They're like in any profession, there are things we need to learn. And it's not enough to write a good PhD thesis in that respect. You need to learn how to be an effective teacher. You need to how to build yourself, let's say, a publication record, how to publish in English, because as we know, this is the key to international notoriety, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, as we heard from Minister Lubiova, there is a technological component. It is clear that if you want to hope to be effective in classrooms in the years to come, familiarity with technological instruments is part of the toolkit that we must all acquire, particularly those of us who happen to be operating in countries which have faced difficulties basically in inserting themselves in the European mainstream. These would be, I think, worthwhile of our attention and worthy objectives for the next 30 years. And in concluding, I simply want to say that at our modest level, we at the European Institute are, of course, prepared to do our part in that respect. We want to invest in what we regard as an intrinsic part of our mission to assist early stage researchers from countries which, the so-called widening countries in Eurospeak, to fare better and to achieve success very rapidly. We believe that we have gained a certain know-how through our 40 years of existence, and we want to put this at the service of all European countries without exception.
Bruno, thank you very much. I completely agree. I think something that's perhaps is overlooked is our Europe Early Career Researchers, ECRs. Perhaps an ECR Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence, THEMIS, again on the shopping list. Tech transfer, vocation. I'm a huge advocate of Jean Monnet Junior, but I think Jean Monnet vocational structures of some sort should and can be part of where Jean Monnet should go in the next 30 years. And particularly with regards to 21st century pedagogy, I think both Alberto put his finger on this as well. You've heard lots and lots from us, lucky you, but it's time now, I think, to hear a little bit from you as well. So I'm very pleased to move into a Q&A session. The emphasis is on the word question. So if we cannot have extended comments, it would be great, because we would like to generate answers. That is, of course, the whole point. I think we have some roving mics. So what I'd like to do is take a handful of questions, and we've got a Twitter wall, and I'll consult that as well. So we'll start with whoever can put their hands up first. So this gentleman here, and then the lady behind him. Do please stand and introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Professor Mario Tello, Serge Monet since 20 years already, and professor at ULB Brussels and Louis Rome. Well, I like it very much, the debate. It's very alive, very diverse, starting with your excellent presentation and so on. But I didn't hear very much about the projection out of Europe. Whereas I know that we have competence here about this particular issue, which is crucial for the future. The word Erasmus Mundus has never been pronounced.
Okay.
Whereas we work since 10 years in a PhD network, including 65 PhD students, 12 universities at the global level. The single issue has been mentioned is about the global challenges, Professor Zwitter, and the relation with the United States. But it's very Western inward looking. We should talk about Africa, the Arab world, China, India, Latin America. What about the global vocation of Erasmus Mundus? Is that, or there is a future for that, or is Europe condemned to be a small island, declining island? Thank you.
That's a great question, thanks. The lady just behind. There we go. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Monika Oberle from the University of Göttingen, and I really liked your discussion about mobility and languages. I myself studied in Perugia at the Foreigners University, went with Erasmus to London to study politics, and traveled the world both privately and academically. But I didn't learn about the European Union by mobility and languages itself. That's why I would like to stress the importance, which was also sometimes addressed here, of civic education regarding the EU. And we know there's great Jean Monnet success stories in the room also. And but to put it into a question, something that I've been wondering for years. In Germany, we have a very famous federal agency for civic education. This is not a communication agency of the German government. They do that as well. But it's something that is meant to be non-partisan. It is multi-perspective. It gets quite a lot of money right now with the right-wing populism threat. And they are also considered by many different sides as an advocate that is, it's considered and listened to, and they have great material as well. And on the European level, we have communication material. Sometimes they are called, entitled, How the Euro is Good for Everyone. And that's a good example of, although I like the idea of the euro, if you want to address this in civic education, it needs to be addressed controversially. So why not have something like a European agency for civic education that is 28 or 27 national perspectively and partisan multi-perspectively? There's great people who could work on that, and then have that in the 24 languages of the European Union, not just information material, but good material that can be used for a controversial civic education.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there was a question just across the aisle here. That gentleman, or? All right, yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Senada. I come from Croatia. I'm also EUI alumni, and I also implement a Jean Monnet project. And I would like to comment and maybe get your response. And it's basically reiterating what I think Alberto Alemanno said about our, I think, necessity to reach out to society. And the reason why I hear these messages now basically come from a few years ago when I participated in several discussions prior to Brexit referendum in the UK. And I remember colleagues and political scientists discussing the outcomes and what are possible scenarios, but at the same time not being willing to come out basically and say what they think. They would say it privately, but they said, well, it would damage our neutrality and we may become partial and so on and so on. And the outcome is what we know. So what I want to reiterate, I think we need to consciously remind ourselves that it is all fine to pursue impact factors and our excellence in publishing, but at the same time, the larger interest, the larger responsibility lies in improving our societies. And it's not always easy because we easily become technocrats who simply contain ourselves in living in ivory towers. But the challenge of confronting the political and other social challenges and the reactions that we have in our societies, I think, force us. And what I want us is to use also this opportunity and others to have this community of support among ourselves.
Okay.
And in that sense, maybe Alberto, but also some others can comment. Thank you.
Okay, let's get some answers to this first round. So a very astute question, I think, obviously, on the global vocation projecting out of Europe, more on civic education and communication agents, and then, again, reaching out to society. I think, should we start from my right and go left, and then with the other questions, we'll go the other way. Paola, would you like to start? You can choose any one you like.
Sure, well, I'll... Again, I'm here to represent sort of the EU external relations, or certainly, you know, that realm. We are not directly involved in the Erasmus Mundus program. However, our emphasis is in giving junior and senior scholars an opportunity to spend a few months, in the United States, where they get a different perspective, a different kind of education, both in terms of substance, but also in terms of perspective. And so, and I want to stress that our goal of all Fulbright programs is to return home. We place important on the role of education as part of strengthening your skills, your expertise, by being exposed to different cultures and different opportunities, but then applying that expertise in your home country or in Europe, because as European citizens, we're all part of this big community. So this is our contribution to expanding beyond Europe.
Lorenzo, I wonder if I can quickly turn to you. I suspect you might have something to say, particularly on the internationalization and external dynamic here.
Yes, I think this is really crucial. Europe cannot be inward-looking, and I think, well, personally, I've been spending 20 years of my life outside of the European continent, and if there's one thing that I can tell you for sure is that, for instance, the Jean Monnet program is one of those programs that has a significant impact outside of Europe, and different countries look up to it. But it struggles to make inroads in some regions, also because there's been a tendency historically to look at it as a way of, shall I just say, worship the European mantra within Europe, and sort of, like sort of an evangelical sort of mission to tell academics and the academia how good Europe is. And that is not the purpose of the program. The purpose of the program should be much more in line with what I think my colleague from Göttingen said, like creating a space for critical analysis of how Europe can improve, how the integration process is a never-ending one. Europe is a continuously changing reality that needs to be fed with new ideas and innovation. And some of these ideas may not come from Europe. Some of the regional integration processes that we as Europeans may want to learn from may be outside of the European continent. So I think we need to be, in a sense, much more creative, much more willing to look critically at our own experience, but to strengthen it, to make it stronger, to make it more in line, more resilient vis-a-vis the external criticism and its internal weaknesses. And I think, well, some of us have done a lot of work on this, showing how regionalism, for instance, regional integration can happen at different levels in many different ways. And Europeans may have perfected one of few examples of regionalism, but that's not the end of the story. And I think this sort of ability of the European academic community to really, in this area, to really look at the rest of the world, engage the rest of the world, and compete, if you will, as well as collaborate more successfully with other regions, I think is extremely important. We shouldn't be seen as an island, we should be seen as part of a network, and I think maybe an important node of a network, but a network.
Martina, I wonder if you'd like to.
Thank you. Just very quickly, actually, I would scan through all the 3 points, but rather quickly. In terms of the global challenges, I very much agree. This is a very crucial issue. Slovakia is a small open economy. We are really very, very volatile and very open to any international pressures. At the same time, nowadays, the political debate at home is very sensitive to the issues of immigration. So, this kind of opening up is not really going down well with the electorate, and I wouldn't even say a word migration, not being a Ministry of Interior. So, but actually this can be used towards actually even fostering Erasmus Mundus, because we say if any foreigners, then we want to compete for the high skilled. And actually this is the venue how the highly skilled people are coming to the country or can get exposure to the country, is that they participate and there is an exchange with the academic communities and scientific communities. So in that sense, I would say that Erasmus Mundus is actually one of the vehicles that can show the benefits of migration rather than, scaring people and these xenophobic moods. So good points for Erasmus Mundus. And as regards languages, absolutely, I think, yes, we should be multilingual, we should be opening. I am now the one who is championing in our country diversification of languages at the grammar school, because so far we only had English as the first foreign language, which was obligatory. Now I'm putting in other 5 languages, and I have a lot of opposition to that, so I have to overcome this politically, because liberal parties, who are our opponents, are fighting liberalization of language education. They're ridiculing themselves basically, but they have to be in opposition to us, so it's very upset situations that are now rising. But I'm very much, and I think this was the point, let us not just have the English information materials, let us have the content materials and in many languages. Because in Slovakia, in the last Euro elections, the turnout was 13%. I think we were the last 28 or 27 of the EU, and actually one of the reasons is that lack of knowledge and lack of really content-based materials. Just some info leaflets in English. They are not going to bring the people into the EU topics. And language is a crucial issue because we don't have enough, let's say, language mastership in other languages and then in national language. And finally, coming back to the comment by the Croatian colleague, and this links in my mind very much to also what Mr. President has said. Perhaps we should not dwell that much on the impact scientific publications at the expense of integrating or improving our societies. So giving it more qualitative angle. And this is what I think also Mr. President was pointing at, that excellence is one thing, and of course nobody wants to compromise on excellence, but there is certain trade-off, and let us call it rather a complementarity, whereas we really, and this brings me back to my political shoes, we cannot exclude the countries with low level of excellence, because if I actually look at the countries which are not member states of, or not members of EUI, these are the countries with low excellence, which gives us certain lead to justifying why they are actually not interested in participation. We really have to balance excellence and participation. We have to balance impact and improving the societal angles in order to make this tool very much amalgamating. Thank you.
Andre, can we turn to you?
Yes, we do face global challenges also in higher education, and specifically in higher education in Europe. I give you a short anecdote. I studied in Graz University, and when I once went to the toilet at the physics department, there was a marble board on the wall, and it said, in this building worked Boltzmann, Schrödinger, Mach, and after the 70s, nobody else. I was wondering whether this building was empty by now, but apparently still in use. I had a look recently for an article I wrote for a newspaper on how much we are spending in Europe on higher education. And it is on average not changing particularly. It is around 2% of the GDP. Now, if you have a look at what China is spending on education, then we are around 3.5%. And when you look how China is spending its money, then it is very centralized and it's very focused on a few institutions, 10 core universities that are being fostered. What do we see? They're climbing in the ranking tremendously. The US is staying very stable in the ranking, and what we see is that European universities are either staying stable because they are still having a buffer from the last few decennia, or they are declining. Now, I think this is a challenge that European higher education is facing, and it's a challenge that we need to address. And how can we address that? On the one hand, we need to think again, what are we good at in Europe? And I think what we are good at is the creation of knowledge. We have shown that for the past 500 years. And using that knowledge to strengthen our position in the world. Now, if we abandon that for the sake of whatever politics, we are doomed to fall into the backwaters of education. And I see that happening slowly. So what we need to do is we need to continue investing more in higher education, and education on all levels. We need to continue investing in the internationalization of education and in international partnerships, because before long, we will be forgotten as preferred partners in Asia and in the US.
Andre, thanks very much. Alberto.
Civic education is a subject that is very close to my heart, and I spend a lot of time thinking or rethinking about civic education. And the first problem I have with civic education is the name, is the semantics. As soon as you say civic education, it's a no-brainer. Nobody really likes it. It reminds you of these classes which were very boring, in which you learn your rights and you read the Constitution. So this is a no-go. If we talk about civic education today, we have to reinvent it. We have to talk about participation. There's an incredible demand for participation in society. There is not demand for traditional forms of political involvement, but other forms of participation that we call new power. We talk about things that today are happening at the very grassroots level. And this demand of participation is legitimate, but we are not able to accommodate it. We are not even able to channel it in a way which is constructive because the basics are not there. So what can we do? Well, part of the work I'm doing now is to think about a public policy for democracy. We have a public policy for every single thing, but we don't have a public policy for democracy, meaning we don't have a set of ideas, tools, and mechanisms that feed and invest into democracy to make it last, to make it ingrained in what we do, and to basically push people to engage in society beyond voting. And today we don't even vote. Crazy ideas related to the educational world. Why don't we use the opportunity of master papers, theses of our very young students not to serve the public interest? You have plenty of NGOs, civil society organizations who have actual needs. They don't have capability to do disk research, to read the newspaper, to be monitoring what is happening in the world. Why we do not connect the talent and purpose of many students with the needs of society. Another brief example of what we can do is to systematically encourage departments in universities to engage with the local communities along the lines of what I suggested, but also setting up labs, one-stop shops open to citizens to get information, to get ideas on how to move the things forward. And in the European space, I've been making a case for many years and experimenting this space that the European Union offers today many more avenues of participation than any other country in the world, and certainly in the European Union. You have public consultations every single week. You have possibility of lodging petitions, complaints. You have the European Citizen Initiatives. Most of these instruments, even at the College of Europe, where I have the pleasure to teach this year, are still not well mastered and known, to the point of being misused by the usual organized interest, who are using participation in a different way. What, and I'm going to close, if we were able to demystify and democratize those tools so that many more voices could get into the process and many more students, faculties would be involved as ambassadors, as facilitators or mediators of those tools. We have all what we need, we just need to connect the dots, as it is often the case.
I think that's a beautiful segue to João in terms of student participation.
Absolutely, but I feel so covered with this that I'm not going to go into that. No, because absolutely, the structures are in place. They're not just connected as they could be. And also, of course, there's a serious problem when it comes to the lack of recognition and lack of funding of these organizations. We have to see that the operating grants for civil society organizations in education field are among the smallest grants given to organizations that work around this. Now, but I want to go back to the Erasmus Mundus topic, because it's just so interesting that I get to contribute to this answer by a question by Professor Tewa, because the first time I went to Brussels, where I reside today, was to attend an Erasmus Mundus course organized by you in 2014. So it's interesting how life turns a cycle. Now, I can guarantee, I don't speak on behalf of the European Commission, but working very closely with the program, I know a few things about it, is that Erasmus Mundus is very, very high on the agenda. And this is, of course, instigated by the global strategy of 2016, in which public diplomacy becomes a very core topic of that strategy. So it's understood that individuals, especially alumni of the Erasmus Plus program, but other programs, Marie Curie, Jean Monnet, etc., become an essential tool for the European Union to expand its influence through every single citizen out there. So it's the elements of public diplomacy. How is this going to happen in the first place? Well, already now, in 2017, the traineeship option of Erasmus Plus was expanded into the global dimensions. Now it's possible to go on a traineeship around the world. This year, 2018, the vocational education and training on Erasmus was also expanded throughout the world. So now a person learning to become a mechanic can go to Indonesia and participate in a mechanic course in Indonesia. And then finally, very interesting aspect about Erasmus Mundus is that the #1 destination is actually Middle East and Northern Africa. That also has to do with how we allocate resources and the priorities that the member states and the European Union decide. And #1 country is, of course, Israel, probably for other reasons. Now, just to conclude on this topic, I have myself some criticisms about the way this is done at the EU level. Right now, just this year, 2019, in January, was launched the new EU Alumni Engagement Initiative, which is the brand new, flashy initiative ran by the External Action Service in collaboration with a few other DGs. And this one actually gathers the alumni of many different programs under one single umbrella and has many, many, many goals of things to happen around the world. The problem that I face with this is that this mobility is not necessarily balanced. It's a lot about bringing people to Europe, not so much about bringing Europeans to other parts of the world. I sense here a bit the smell of new colonialism in the kind of approach, and I don't like that. I'll prefer to see a more balanced mobility, like it's done in a few other programs, like the ASEM Duo program, the Asia-Europe Mobility Program, in which for every student sent, one student is received. Now, of course, the logistics are very different there, but it's far more fair for those countries that face a lot of brain drain challenges. And through Erasmus Mundus actions, we risk deepening some of those brain drain challenges.
João, thanks very much. Can we conclude with you? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me first react to what I just heard. I understand João's concern. We don't want to venture again on the dangerous ground of neocolonialism, but it's important to acknowledge that on the world scene, Europe has values and it has also interests, and that they need to be voiced and acted in favor of, because we know that we are confronted with a number of big powers who don't necessarily share the kind of values that we have. And I find, for instance, interesting the emphasis on education in the recent discussions between the EU and Japan. I think it means that they acknowledge that they have values in common that need to be protected. But I also want, in my concluding remarks, to emphasize what I would call the outreach dimension, which has been mentioned by several of the people who took the floor. I think it's very important indeed. We know that reaching out to society at large is one of the, it's been recalled earlier by Alberto, I think, in his remarks. It's one of the key missions of universities, but it's also clear that they don't always find a way in order to, let's say, achieve the kind of impact that would be needed in order to get their role recognized in society. This is very important, and this must be the focus of our attention, I think, to a larger extent than has been the case in the past. Not only because we're constantly confronted with the criticism of being elitist. Even if we don't want to be elitist, we have to be recognizing that somehow we cater for, let's say, a privileged few. Too limited are the people who may benefit from our programs. And therefore, it's important for us to make it clear to society at large that what we do has societal relevance. It's important because we are publicly funded for the most part, and it's a way, therefore, to illustrate that this is money that is well spent, where indeed you might argue there is indeed a need for more funding. But let's face facts also. It's clear that not everyone is willing to invest more in higher education, nor is everyone able to do so. So it will be all the more important for us to reach out to other stakeholders in societies who could possibly make up for the gap in public funding. And that entails a very strong communication policy. It's, when you work in the natural sciences, it's fairly easy to explain often why you're relevant. I mean, if you do research on stem cells or cancer, everybody understands. But if you do, as is the case for most of us, work in the social sciences and the humanities, it tends to be a bit more difficult. And surprisingly, when you look at the distribution of fund for in research programs, what you notice is that let's say, the scope that is reserved for the social sciences and the humanities is not only smaller, but often shrinking. So outreach is not merely something we should do because it is our mission, which I strongly believe, but we should also engage in it more actively because it happens to be part of, let's say, an important question for our future. And that's why I was referring to the training of early stage researchers. I mean, I think this should include, let's say, a greater communication part than has been the case so far. It's important for them to use, to understand how best to use the social media, how to write a blog post, and that kind of thing, which in my times, of course, were not at all part of the training of young people. So we have new frontiers to explore, and let's make sure that we do it, because otherwise we might face difficulties in the future.
I'm going to stand up here because this way you know we're nearly finished. You've heard from an incredibly eminent panel on a multiplicity of issues and some incredibly thoughtful responses, and I do thank each and every one of you. Only they know how many emails they've had from me with regards to how to run this panel, and I'm so pleased we've had a nice balance of the very intimate, I think the very personal in terms of reflections on how much Jean Monnet and how much Erasmus has meant to them, and the way in which it's really carved them out as intellectuals, but also the way in which it's boosted them as professionals. And I think that nexus between the two is very, very important. I'd like to conclude, if I can, by trying to draw together the role that Erasmus plays in terms of its mobility and national communities and sectors. It, in my mind, works very much horizontally. It's a very horizontal dynamic. But Jean Monnet, I think, is a vertical one. I think you're trying to pull together top-down initiatives, but bottom-up dynamism, and that's a very tough one. You're talking about teaching and learning and research and policy engagement. But what happens when they connect? What happens at that interface? That engagement, that absolutely vital engagement between vertical and horizontal, between mobility and outreach and activities on the one side, and really critical learning and teaching on the other side. I think we should be too careful not to make them analytically separate. It is one project, absolutely one project. We've succeeded in getting to the end without anybody mentioning the enormous elephant in the room, and that's the B word. I'm not even going to say it, I'll just say the B word. And standing here as a Canadian citizen, but also as a British subject, Jean Monnet and Erasmus have never been more important. They are absolutely vital to reminding those of us less persuaded of the merits of the European project that we are all still heirs to Europe. We owe Europe a debt of peace and thanks and civilization. Jean Monnet said, "Nothing is possible without people, but nothing lasts without institutions." So I'd like you to join with me in thanking our panel and also commending Jean Monnet. Many thanks.
Well done.